On the first half, we're fighting 4 waves of enemies, spawning in groups of 2 or 3 at a time. In terms of elemental restrictions, there aren't really any hard requirements. You might want to bring a pyro character to help deal with the Fatui skirmishers' cryo shields, but I found that I could still clear this side in decent time even without any pyro. The more important thing is to use a team that can deal a decent amount of damage to 2 or 3 enemies at a time. You don't need a huge area of effect on your attacks because the enemies do a pretty good job of staying together on their own, but I also don't recommend using a team that only deals single target damage. The enemies themselves aren't exceptionally difficult in terms of combat mechanics, but the sheer number of waves we need to grind through can easily drag this fight out. The key on this half is making sure you can execute your rotations cleanly and consistently so that you can continuously output damage wave after wave. From a positional aspect, I try to keep the fight close to the center of the arena because that's where all of the waves spawn. All of the enemies you fight on this half are melee ranged, so even if one of them splits off from the pack, I usually just wait for it to return to the center instead of going out of my way to chase after it. The only other positional tip I can offer is to focus the high HP enemies on waves 2 and 4. In the second wave, the Eremite Day Thunder is much tankier than the other two, and similarly on the last wave, the Construction Mech has a lot more HP than the Recon Mechs, so I recommend keeping your focus on those enemies while letting your AoE damage take care of the weaker enemies. One mechanical tip that can be slightly useful is that most of the mechs are Numa aligned, which means an Usha aligned character can disable some of their attacks. Again, I don't recommend going out of your way to force these characters into your team, but if you already have a team that incorporates these characters, they can give you a slight edge on this half. As we go into some other team comps that work on this half, I want to reiterate that rather than the specific team comp you choose, the more important thing is being able to output continuous damage by executing your rotations repeatedly back to back. For teams that rely heavily on their bursts, Favonius weapons and high energy recharge in general can help you maintain good uptime on your rotations. Overloaded teams do pretty well here since they deal a good amount of AoE damage like we saw with the Kazuha Overload team just now. A Chevy Overload team is also quite good if that's something you can put together. Chevy also happens to be an Usha aligned character, so you naturally trigger those Usha attacks every now and then that make the fight just a little bit easier like I mentioned before. Along the same vein, Overvape teams are also very effective here. Raiden National is kind of the quintessential Overvape team comp, and you can really see how quickly it works through all of these waves of enemies. And of course, you can't talk about AoE damage without mentioning Neuvillette. Most variations of Neuvillette team comps will work on this half. Here I'm using a pretty typical budget variation, but I'm using Xiangling in the 4th slot instead of something like Fischl or Beidou, just to give me that extra pyro application in case the Fatui cryo shields come up. Shanyun plunge teams are another family of team comps that work on this half, again thanks to their solid AoE damage. I don't have Xiao, but since I do have Shanyun, I can use this Hutao version of the team comp which has a very similar playstyle. The relatively large AoE of these high plunge attacks gives us enough coverage to defeat multiple enemies at the same time. And finally, Arlecchino or Hutao Vaporize teams do surprisingly well on this half despite dealing mostly single target damage. The sheer DPS that they're able to output is actually enough to hunt down the enemies one by one and still get a decent clear time. That having been said, the Lunar Blessing for this first cycle of the Spiral Abyss gives an enormous buff to teams that utilize pyro-based reactions, so just be cognizant of that if you're watching this during the second or third cycle of this Abyss where the Lunar Blessing might not be the same. On the second half, we're fighting the Iniquitous Baptist, a bit of a notorious boss that can be frustrating for a lot of players because of the elemental restrictions it imposes on our team comps. For this iteration of the Abyss, it uses Pyro, Cryo, and Electro shields in that order, exposing a brief vulnerability window each time you break his shield, and a longer vulnerability window after you break that third Electro shield. For most players, it will take about 2 full shield cycles to defeat this boss, and each cycle takes about 40 seconds. That gives us about 80 seconds total to defeat this boss, so you're aiming to clear the first half with about 8:20 remaining on the clock. Based on the shield elements, we can combine the shield weaknesses in a couple different ways to give us a few viable team comps that will work on this half. First off, combining Hydro to break the Pyro shield, and Pyro to break the Cryo and Electro shields, we arrive at the Vaporize family of team comps. One thing to keep in mind is that we'll need some pretty high uptime on Pyro application because we're using it for two different shield phases. We can use teams like the National family of team comps or a Vaporize Arlecchino team comp, which both fit these requirements. Another combination is to take Hydro for the Pyro shield, Electro for the Cryo shield, and Dendro for the Electro shield, giving us a Hyperbloom team comp. The Nahida Xingqiu Kuki Hyperbloom core is one that fits this archetype well, but Kuki's Electro application is a little slow at breaking the Cryo shield by herself, so I recommend putting an extra Electro or Pyro support in that fourth slot. Lastly, we can also take Hydro, Pyro, and Dendro to form a Burgeon team, and Nahida National is a team that worked well for me here that fits this combination. Now, we've looked at a few different team comps that can technically work against this boss, but having the right elements on your team is only half the challenge in this fight. You also need to have the right execution to make sure you're using the appropriate element against the corresponding shield type. Taking this national team as an example, I make sure to save Xingqiu's skill for when the Pyro shield is up, since that skill is a big chunk of our Hydro application. Likewise, I rely mostly on Bennett and Xiangling's abilities during the Cryo and Electro shield phases, trying to make the most of my Pyro application to break those shields. This is a good place to mention that shortly after the boss uses its Electro shield, it will teleport away from you, usually moving slightly behind and then either to the left or right side of you. So if you are using a team like National where your movement is kind of limited by Bennett's burst, I recommend waiting for the teleport before using those stationary abilities. Looking at another example with my Hyperbloom team, again I wait for the Pyro shield to use Xingqiu's skill and burst. I activate Kuki's skill, which will help chip down the Cryo shield a little bit, but then I bring in Toma to help me break that Cryo shield a lot faster. And finally, during the Electro shield, I rely on my sources of Dendro and Pyro application to break that shield as quickly as possible. Again, the key takeaway from these examples is to line up your abilities and elements with the shield type that they're most effective against. With that said, let's dive into a few more team comps that worked well for me on this half. I briefly mentioned this one earlier, but I found this Nahida National team to be extremely effective against this boss. It has great uptime on all three elements that are involved, and deals a good mix of AoE damage for the previous chambers, as well as high single target damage for this chamber. Another one I mentioned earlier, an Arlecchino Vaporize team comp, supported by Zhongli to offer Arlecchino a lot of protection, and Bennett for some extra Pyro application to help with breaking the Electro shield. For those that don't know already, this team has just absurdly high single target DPS. This was actually the team that got closest to defeating this boss with a single shield cycle, and if my Arlecchino were built a little bit better, I think it actually would have. I also had some success with a Neuvillette Virgin team on this half. A team like this technically has all the elements required to break the shields, but that having been said, I don't strongly recommend this team, just because Neuvillette is much better utilized on the first half of this chamber if you do have him. Those are all the tips I have for this chamber. I hope this helps you get a little closer to a 3-star clear. The builds for all the characters I used in this video will follow shortly, and as always, thank you so much for watching.